Gresham College presents Genius or Madness by Professor Glenn D. Wilson, Visiting Gresham Professor of Psychology.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Lovely to see you all. I'm Glenn Wilson, Visiting Professor of Psychology at Gresham College. That's not my self-portrait there. That's another fellow that I'll mention very shortly. I'm going to be talking about the thin line dividing genius and madness, neither of which I suffer from myself particularly. It was recognized by the poets for 1,000 years or more. Dryden, for example, said, "Great wits are sure to madness, near allied, and thin partitions to their bounds divide." Earlier than that, Roman poet Seneca said, "There is no great genius without a tincture of madness." And that, I suppose, is a summary or the theme of what I'm about to be telling you. Now, if we look at some of the great geniuses in the past, a number of them seem to have gone mad in their mature years. Take Isaac Newton, whom many people would regard as the greatest scientist of all time, introduced the concept of gravity, made significant contributions to mechanics, optics, and mathematics. But he suffered from personality disorder of one sort or another. He was intensely suspicious and distrustful of colleagues and competitors. And in later life, he dabbled in alchemy and sought hidden messages in the Bible. Now, I suppose in the time, neither of those would necessarily condemn you to the diagnosis of insanity. But insofar as they seemed a little peculiar, given his background, it might be that they could be explained by the fact that in his early experiments in alchemy, he acquired mercury toxicity, and that might account for some of his weirdness. As a matter of interest, his studies of the Bible came up with the end of the world in 2060. Now, I don't think I'll be around personally to discover whether he was right about that. If he is right, he'll have to go down as an even greater genius than we recognize already. But many people have predicted the end of the world, and so far it hasn't happened. Now, a couple of other people that are often cited as good examples of a crossover between madness and genius. Beethoven was a little bit manic, a bit irascible, tempestuous as a personality. But insofar as he was a little mad, there are many physical explanations. He may have contracted syphilis. He may have had lead poisoning. And, of course, his progressive deafness would be pretty maddening to most people, not least a composer, a man who depends upon music for everything that made life worthwhile to him. So I'm not sure that Beethoven is a very good example either. Van Gogh, whose portrait we had for the opening slide there, was commonly said to be suffering from bipolar mood disorder. But this is by no means clear. Part of the evidence was that he cut off his own ear, supposedly in a fit of depression. There is an alternative theory that he actually got involved in a duel with his friend Gauguin, who was an expert with the saber, and that he might have sliced off his ear, and that he said he did it himself in order to protect his friendship with Gauguin. He's also supposed to have committed suicide, but there are some that say that this is very unlikely. The entry path of the bullet was such that he could hardly have shot himself. And some people are saying that he was actually shot by a bunch of boys playing cowboys in the cornfield, and that once again he sought to protect them by saying that he'd shot himself. This is just before he died, incidentally. The wound was ultimately fatal, but he took a couple of days in agony before he went out. Now, insofar as Van Gogh was perhaps a little bit mad from time to time, An alternative theory is that he suffered from porphyria, which is what accounts for the madness of King George III. The film was called The Madness of King George because the Americans were afraid that if they put a 3 at the end of it, people would think this was a sequel and they'd missed the previous 2. But you no doubt know the story, and it is a metabolic disorder, genetic and quite rare, and some people think that Van Gogh suffered from that as well. Some better examples of a mixture of madness and genius. One is Nikola Tesla, who was a Serbian scientist who rivaled Edison as a great inventor, particularly with radio, whom some people say he actually discovered. And electrical technology of one sort or another. The Tesla coil was a system for generating plasmic electricity that is still used today, both for striking visual displays and for scientific purposes. Hydroelectric power is attributed to him, and of course AC current, which made it possible to build the skyscrapers in New York, because Edison wanted direct current, and you'd never get that up to the top of a skyscraper. Tesla spoke 8 languages, had a photographic memory, many great talents, but he was also a little bit odd. He claimed to be in communication with other planets, or perhaps he was. He claimed to have invented death rays. Once again, we can't be certain that wasn't true, but we know that he also displayed various bizarre obsessional compulsive behaviors of one sort or another, that he was celibate, reclusive, and supposedly slept for only 2 hours a night. This is on his own account, but he was certainly a strange character, apart from being an outstanding genius. Another one you might know from the film A Beautiful Mind is John Nash, Nobel Prize-winning mathematician who developed game theory, particularly as applied to the social sciences. Now, he experienced paranoid delusions and was hospitalized against his will, and he said that he had to feign sanity in order to get out again. He still heard the voices, he said, but he learned not to take any notice of them and certainly not to talk about them. And he was quoted as saying, "I wouldn't have had such good scientific ideas if I had thought more normally." He doesn't look quite like Russell Crowe, does he, the fellow who played him in the film? Now, sometimes it might be a case of where you are and when as to whether you will be recognized as a genius or seen as a bit crazy. Galileo, who of course took up the Copernican idea of the planets revolving around the sun rather than the Earth being the center of the universe, was declared absurd by the Vatican in 1633, and his ideas were regarded as so dangerous that he needed to be kept in house arrest for the rest of his life. The Catholic Church has since actually vindicated him and even apologized in 2000. Took them a while to get around to recognizing that that might have been a miscarriage of justice. They didn't necessarily regard him as mad, of course. They might have been afraid he was right. But I think to them it was obvious, if you read the Bible, that the earth was here before the sun and the moon. It wasn't until the 4th day that God did the lighting plan, with a big light by day and a little bed lamp at night. So there is no way of reading the Bible without and making it compatible with this heliocentric theory. I mean, even the plants were made before the sun and the moon. So it's not surprising that in the time Galileo was regarded as a bit crazy, perhaps. Today, of course, we might think that people who adhere to fundamentalist readings of scriptures, we might think that's evidence of craziness and reverse the whole thing. Now, there are lots of stories about people who have compiled great lists of famous people through history who have presented with rather crazy symptoms. And they're rather uncontrolled studies, and some people have gone as far as to say, well, maybe the case has been over-egged because of a few famous examples, including the ones that I have described, and that the connection between genius and madness is not so clear as it might be. But the best evidence in favour of it comes from the fact that the close relatives of creative people have higher rates of schizophrenia, and vice versa. That is, that psychotic people have more creative relatives. And it's quite a strong connection. It's been noticed for a long time. Francis Galton, in his book Hereditary Genius, said, "I've been surprised at finding how often insanity or idiocy has appeared among the near relatives of exceptionally able people." And he was thinking quite a bit of his own family, which included the Darwins, the Huxleys, the Galtons, and the Wedgwoods. Tony Benn, incidentally, is a modern descendant of this family group, and I leave you to decide whether that is a case of genius, madness, or perhaps neither. Example here, Einstein had a schizophrenic son. Bertrand Russell had several schizophrenic relatives. They're just examples of a well-sustained finding that relatives of schizophrenics are creative and vice versa. Now, it's interesting that mental disorder is actually more common in the close relatives of creative people than the creative people themselves. And you can conclude from that probably the illness impedes creative success. It's hard to get on as a scientist or an artist if you're completely potty and spending most of your day in a padded cell and straitjacket. So that's perhaps not a great surprise. But an exception seems to be writers, who, according to this Giaga et al. Study, a very recent and important study, writers themselves have higher rates of a lot of disorders, including schizophrenia, mood disorders, anxiety, alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide. All of those are higher in writers, not just their relatives. Virginia Woolf being an example, a famous depressive who finally drowned herself. There are plenty of others that might come to mind. Now, there is another observation, an environmental one, leaving aside the heredity for a moment, that childhood trauma and orphan status seem to be more common in high achievers. They are orphans, quote the Pirates of Penzance, according to the Goetzel et al. Study. And you might think, well, maybe people who have deprived and traumatic upbringings use that experience in their creative work. The passions that they feel and the horrors that they have experienced emerge in the music or books that they write. Charles Dickens might be a fine example of that. His father was in debtor's prison. He had to leave school early and work in a factory. And, of course, he used these themes of child poverty, maltreatment, and social reform was a central theme in many of his books. Against that, we have to note that wealth is actually more frequent than poverty in the families of famous people. That emerged in the same study. So we shouldn't get too distracted by the idea that you have to have an impoverished childhood to become great. It's certainly not a rule. And it is also possible that the ill treatment of a child is genetically linked to the parent, and it is that genetic link which accounts for the creativity of the child and the maltreatment by their parents. There is a sort of a strand of craziness that goes through them. Cradles of Eminence, incidentally, was the name of Goetzel's book. Now, what is it that links genius and madness? Well, there are certain types of thinking. They tend to have novel ideas, unconventional ideas, grandiose ideas. They're often workaholics, very persistent, very ambitious. They're often self-indulgent and self-promoting, tremendous self-confidence. And certain genes and neurotransmitters have been implicated in this connection. One is testosterone, which of course is a typically male hormone. Growth factors, one called neuregulin, has been implicated, and some genes that modulate dopamine in the brain. I'll come back to dopamine in a minute. It's a neurotransmitter that runs through certain brain circuits that I will describe in a moment. Now, Hans Eysenck, who was my mentor at the Institute of Psychiatry, reckoned that the connection comes through a personality trait called psychoticism. P was his abbreviation for it. And it includes aspects of novelty-seeking, risk-taking, impulsiveness, nonconformity, self-confidence, and work addiction are some of the characteristics of the person who is high in Eysenck's P dimension. And Eysenck reported a great deal of research that would suggest that both dopamine and testosterone were involved in high P scores. And dopamine and testosterone, of course, are related in the sense that dopamine increases testosterone and vice versa. Now, here's a study which suggests that another personality type called schizotypy, which is rather similar in some ways, one of Eysenck's students called Gordon Claridge did a great deal of work on what he called schizotypy. And what has been found by other researchers is that if you have some pointers towards some indications of schizotypy, you are more likely to be a creative achiever. Perhaps a couple of schizotypy indicators would be the optimum, but too many, full-blown schizophrenia does not tend to promote creative achievement. Back to dopamine. And these are the dopamine areas, the midbrain, limbic system, particularly areas like the striatum, the ventral tegmental area, I suppose it is, nucleus accumbens, and projections into the frontal part of the cortex. They're all systems which you might describe as motivational, concerned with reward, approach, positive mood. And they're implicated in behaviors of novelty-seeking, impulsiveness, psychoticism in Eysenck's terminology, and drug addiction, incidentally. Some people call these circuits sex, drugs, and rock and roll parts of the brain, because they're certainly involved in drug addiction. Schizophrenic thinking is characterized by loose associations, often called thinking outside the box. And these can be observed or measured as unusual responses on a word association test, If I say table, most of you say chair. But a loose association would be table and monkey or something, you see? Something that is not obviously connected. You know, you can see it in the artworks of somebody like Salvador Dali, the lobster telephone here and the Mae West sofa, putting together rather unlikely juxtapositions. You also you see it in Gilbert and Sullivan, and you see it in Monty Python sketches, like Hell's Grannies, for example, the concept of a bunch of delinquent grannies going around terrorizing the young people in city centres, the classic Monty Python joke. Now, of course, you can generate loose or unusual associations with flashcards. You might have seen these used in brainstorming sessions at the office or in a school classroom, perhaps, where you're trying to think of a new idea and you shuffle a pack of cards that have got random words on them, and you see if you can somehow fit the word to a new idea. It's a way of prompting or forcing new ideas. And it's very clear that the great artists and scientists over history tended to be seen as rebels in their field. They would break the rules. Wagner's harmonies broke the rules. Chopin came up with this crazy idea of putting your thumb on a black note, which was forbidden in piano lessons up until that time. But of course, it was only by putting his thumb on a black note or two that he was able to play and write the wonderful stuff that he came up with. Another way of describing it is over-inclusive thinking. Schizophrenics and manics tend to set the boundaries of relevance rather more broadly than most of us do. Too broadly, if you are declaring them mad. But it is similar to the way that great thinkers come up with grand unifications. This is Newton's apple tree, incidentally. It's apparently rooted from the same genetic stock as the apple that fell on Newton's head. This is his cottage near Grantham. And he was supposedly sitting under this tree when an apple fell on his head. I don't think it's literally true that it fell on his head, but he was probably inspired by watching an apple fall and thinking, why does that apple always go straight down? Why doesn't it go sideways or do something different? And so he was able to come up with the concept of gravity and connect an apple falling off a tree with the motion of planets. To most people, there would be no connection between them whatsoever. Now, apophenia refers to a human tendency to see meaningful patterns where there are none. And the face on Mars, captured by the Viking 1 spacecraft, many people thought proved that there must have been life on Mars at some point, or they wouldn't have built this Sphinx-like sculpture. Well, if you see that same mound photographed from different angles and so on, it doesn't look remotely like a face. And the better look at it they got, the more obvious that there was nothing exceptional. It was just a natural landform, but a lot of people got excited by that. People see ghosts, they see UFOs, which, of course, if you think about it, literally means an unidentified flying object, but they immediately say, well, it's got to be a craft from outer space. Miracles, conspiracies, and hearing voices, in the case of the schizophrenics. They are all examples of apophenia, and they are exaggerated in schizotypal persons, and they are also increased by dopamine. Drugs which raise levels of dopamine in the brain increase the tendency toward apophenia, and hence may contribute both to creativity and madness. Now, another disorder that seems to connect with creativity, particularly music and comedy, perhaps, is bipolar mood disorder. Paul Merton is a fine case. He's extraordinary the way he can come up with remote connections between things, which are extremely funny. But he suffered from bipolar mood disorder. He was treated at the Maudsley Hospital. That's not giving away a secret. It's public in the public domain. He also had psychotic symptoms like hearing voices and believing that he was targeted by Freemasons. Well, perhaps he was, but it's a bit unlikely. I'm not sure why they would be out to get him unless he made a joke about the Freemasons, but then virtually everybody else has been a victim of Merton's jokes, and I would have thought Hislop was a much more dangerous character than Merton anyway. So it's a style of comedy that seems to benefit from loose associations. Spike Milligan is another case in point, slightly crazy guy who managed to make it extremely funny. Ruby Wax suffers from mood disorders, writes about them and is happy to talk about them. Stephen Fry is another one who appeared in TV documentaries describing his own bipolar disorder and attempting to understand it and how it connects with creativity. Now, there are treatments for these things, but you may be throwing out baby with bathwater if you treat somebody with a drug and level their mood totally. You might lose some contributions that they have to make to society, which seem to come mostly at the point where they're coming out of the black dog and into the sort of the manic phase of flight of ideas on the way up the cycle. It is a time of exceptional productivity. Now, what is known from the genetic studies is that bipolar mood disorder overlaps with schizophrenia. You can see some chemicals in the brain and genes make a person susceptible to schizophrenia. Some are susceptible to mood disorder, and there are others, like neuroregulin, which seem to link both. It's called schizoaffective disorder in the DSM classification. These are people with both tendencies, like Paul Merton, both mood problems and tendency to have delusions. So this is a schematic diagram that I've stolen from Owen and colleagues. But the actual empirical facts are pretty much consistent with that. And now there's the autistic spectrum disorders, which also might be a source of both madness and creativity. Asperger's syndrome we've heard a lot about with Gary McKinnon, that has just avoided extradition to the United States. He was a genius in the sense that he got into the Pentagon files, although he says it was remarkably easy. I doubt that it was. But he, on the admission of his own mother, he's a bit deficient in social communication. And this is a disorder that has been assigned to many great people throughout history. Michelangelo, Mozart, Newton, Wittgenstein, Marie Curie, and Einstein were all said to be a bit Asperger's, which might be just another way of saying they're a little bit odd, a little bit schizotypal. But the lack of social skill is one of the striking features of it. Perhaps good at numbers, but not very good with people. Michelangelo was completely lacking in social skills. Newton rubbed badly with fellow scientists, fell out badly with his friend, the philosopher Locke, when he was going through his particular mad phase. And Newton actually spent a year as a member of Parliament for his Cambridge constituency. And in all of that time, he made one speech. When he got up, everybody held their breath thinking that this was going to be something rather staggering. And he asked if the window could be closed because the draft was disturbing his wig. That was his sole contribution in a year in Parliament, which I suppose is more than many of them, come to think about it. The savant phenomenon you might be familiar with through the film Rain Man, which concerned an autistic man played by Dustin Hoffman, whose exceptional memory for cards, was exploited by his brother in the Las Vegas casinos. It was, to some extent, based on a real-life character called Kim Peek. This is him, except that he may not have actually been autistic. He seemed to have a chromosome disorder, a rather rare and unpronounceable one, Opitz-Caveggia syndrome, perhaps. Now, savants tend to have exceptional skills in non-social things, musical, mathematical, memory skills. And what they can do is often staggering and unfathomable, but they are usually a bit too narrow and lacking in general IQ to contribute to very much beyond their computational skills, which now, of course, can be done better by computers. All of the autistic spectrum disorders seem to be linked in some way to prenatal testosterone, though it's not fully understood what that connection is. But it's certainly nothing to do with the way your parents treat you. This chap, Louis Wain, was a rather famous patient in the Bethlehem Hospital, the sister hospital to the Maudsley, back in the 1920s. He was a trained artist himself, but he was hospitalized with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And he painted almost entirely cats. And apparently he began to do this because his wife was terminally ill with cancer, and he did cat drawings to entertain her because she was a cat lover. But as his illness progressed, they became progressively abstract, kaleidoscopic, even perhaps scary, you might say. A bit like somebody on an acid trip. And this sequence is published in a lot of textbooks to show the progression of schizophrenia. There's actually little evidence that they were actually painted in that order, but nevertheless it is suggestive. But there is also a debate now that he may actually have suffered from Asperger's rather than schizophrenia. And another idea was that he had acquired T. gondii, toxoplasmosis, a parasite that you catch from what? Cats. And it's a cunning little devil because it has genes in it which will alter the behavior of its host animal. It needs a cat at one point in its life cycle to reproduce. And if it's infected a mouse, it will its genes will get into the brain of the mouse and alter the mouse's behavior to make it more easily caught by the cat and hence chomped up. It'll make the cat fearless and even attracted to cats, which rather reduces the mouse's survival value. So even a tiny parasite has the capacity to cunningly alter the behavior of a host animal. Now, what does it do to humans? Apparently it carries two genes that will raise dopamine levels. And hence some people think that toxoplasmosis, which is actually very common in the population, might be a contributory cause to schizophrenia. Frank could tell you a great deal more about it, I'm sure. When I say common, it's something like 50% of French people are infected with T. gondii, and apparently the likely reason is that they tend to eat their meat more rare than we do. In the case of Anglo-Americans, it may be only 20-25% of people are infected. And for the most part, you won't even notice. but it may be making subtle changes to your behavior. There is, I was talking to Frank about it earlier, and there is a study to the effect that you are more accident prone if you're infected with T. gondii, rather like the mouse that gets itself caught. Going back to the personality of creative artists, there is a fairly famous test called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which scores you on clinical scales like depression, hypochondriasis, hysteria, a bit of a slightly obsolete title, that one. They call it histrionics or something now. Histrionic personality. Paranoia, psychopathic deviation. That looks like psychotic, but it should be psychopathic. Psychasthenia, sort of anxiety, schizophrenia. So they are clinical scales looking a little bit like DSM categories. And the creative artists tend to fall between normal controls and full-blown schizophrenics. So it's as though creative people are on a continuum towards being crazy. But that difference may nevertheless be quite important, because these people are not creative, these people are not creative, but the people halfway in between seem to be those that are most likely to be creative achievers. So you maybe don't have to be mad to be creative, but it may help to be slightly mad, not too mad. Now, one might ask, why does schizophrenia and the genes for it survive in the gene pool? What good are they? And we're getting close to an answer with the overlap, the genetic overlap with creativity and genius. But that's only a partial answer, because you might then ask, well, what good is it to be creative? Who cares? Well, this bowerbird here can tell you that in this species of bird, the males make fancy constructions to attract the females. Lovely nest there, collect together coloured articles wherever they can find them, sorting them by colours. See, all the blue ones are over there, and the minimalist colours are in this heap here, and nice bright ones out the front. They are all totally original, creative constructions. And if the female fancies the artistic arrangement, then she will gravitate towards that male, and he will then pass his genes. Does the same thing apply to people, to humans? Well, apparently yes, because studies have, Clergenol et al., for example, have shown that successful male artists have more sexual partners than unsuccessful ones, whereas there's no such connection for female artists. Now, this sort of implies that creativity is a male courtship thing. Well, that would require that the mass of creativity was male rather than female. And, various researchers summarized or reviewed by Clegg et al. Have found that the male output for art and science is roughly 10 times that of females. Now, of course, you may have some alternative explanations of that, but it is at least consistent with the courtship theory of creativity. Yes, so there's overlap between madness and genius, but perhaps also some important distinctions to consider between them. This is Lucia Joyce, who is the daughter of James Joyce, the famous novelist, Ulysses and so on, who showed talent as a modern dancer in her earlier years, but then became progressively aggressive, self-destructive, and was eventually diagnosed as schizophrenic and hospitalized, where she came under treatment by Carl Jung, who had some other famous patients depicted in a film called A Dangerous Method recently, you might have seen. Now, James Joyce doubted that Lucia could possibly be schizophrenic, he said, because her thought patterns were so similar to his own. And Jung said, no, that's not the case. And he compared father and daughter to two people who had arrived at the bottom of the river. James had dived there, whereas his daughter had fallen in, which is a way of saying that it is a question of control over your behavior, your insight into what is going on, your contact with reality, which is what might be discriminating the genius from the madman. And Salvador Dali, of course, the great surrealist painter, many people have suggested that he was inspired by madness. In a sense, he may have been, but he was never without some degree of self-insight. I like this quotation here. There's one difference between a madman and me. The madman thinks he is sane, whereas I know that I am mad. This painting, of course, is the Metamorphosis of Narcissus, rather famous painting in which Narcissus is the character who is in love with his own reflection, and here he's transformed into a rebirth, an egg with the narcissus bulb sprouting from it. I'm not sure what it exactly all means, but it is a wonderful construction of images and weird ideas. And it's easy to think that Dali was just mad. True, he sort of had a crazy, twirly, villainous moustache and a mad stare in his eyes and so on, but he nevertheless managed to sell a lot of paintings for a lot of money, live a life of great luxury, and win the affection of a great many women. So obviously he was not totally mad.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.